I'll never forget when I first got into fishing a jig. I was watching Gary Klein back in the 2003 Bassmaster Classic, flipping a jig on the Louisiana Delta.
Technique we will see a lot of today, an angler will see a lot of today.
I remember this one real specific fish catch where he flipped a jig into some heavy cover, and you actually saw him bring the jig over a limb, and then all of a sudden, bam, a bass hits it, he catches it, he puts it in the boat. And for me, that was it. I had some jigs at the time, but I really hadn't fished them a lot, and I wanted to learn how to fish them. The week following that Bassmaster Classic, as many fishermen probably did, I spent a lot of money on jigs and jig trailers. But at the time, jig trailers kind of weren't what they are today. In today's world, literally every company has crawls and swim baits, all things you can put on the back of a jig, but you also have trailers that are designed to go on the back of a jig, and it can all be a little bit overwhelming. So today, I just want to simplify jig trailers so that you know exactly what trailer to use on your jig when you get to that lake or pond or river. So stay tuned, it's gonna be a good one.
Never give up! Never give up!
This video is brought to you by sportsmansoutfitters.com. I cannot thank Sportsman's Outfitters enough for just backing this channel. It really helps me to be able to focus on the videos and try to provide you with the highest quality content when it comes to educational bass fishing videos. So if you guys are on the market for new rods and reels or any kind of tackle like the jig trailers I'm gonna talk about today, click those links down below in the description and you're greatly gonna help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel. Now the thing about jigs and jig trailers is that you can really put any type of soft plastic on the back of a jig. And to be honest, sometimes I really don't think that it matters to the bass. But there definitely have been times when I've been fishing out on the water where a simple trailer change actually does make a difference on the number of bites that I'm getting. Probably the two most popular type of trailers to put on a jig are the crawl style trailers. Now there are times when I'm gonna fish something like a swim bait trailer. Another one that I have used a few times is some sort of straight-tailed worm like a Cinco or a Magnum trick worm. Now we will talk about the swim bait and the straight-tail worm at the very end of the video, but right now I really wanna focus in on the crawl style trailers because like I said, that is the one that I use most of the time. Right here we have a Zoom Super Chunk Junior, which is the 2-inch size. We have a Zoom Speed Crawl. We have a Zoom Super Chunk, a Zoom Big Salty Chunk, a Zoom Salty Pro Chunk, a Berkeley Chigger Crawl, and a Strike King Rage Crawl. You really have two categories of trailers here. You have crawls that have a lot of action and a lot of kicking motion, and you have crawls that don't have any kind of kicking motion at all. Now the biggest separator when it comes to fishing a jig trailer that has a lot of action versus one that has no action is really the water temperature. If you are fishing colder water temps, I am going to use a jig trailer that doesn't have a lot of action. Pretty much anything that is underwater when you're fishing cold water doesn't have a tremendous amount of action. And sometimes having too much action on a bait will actually deter a bass from even biting that lure. So I really like those chunk style trailers whenever I'm fishing colder water. Now what I define as cold water is typically about 55 degrees and colder. If you're fishing water temps in the 30s, 40s or low 50s, that is usually when I'm gonna reach for that chunk style trailer. On the flip side, anything in the upper 50s and above is typically when I'm gonna grab that crawl style trailer that has a lot of action to it. Now, pretty much like anything in bass fishing, there's always exceptions to this rule. And there are also times where it simply doesn't matter. The bass could be active enough that they're just going to bite anything that you throw at them because they are fish and they do have a brain that's pretty small. Now, one thing when it does come to water temperature is that you should take in consideration where you live. If you live in Florida and Texas, your water temperatures may never even see 40s, and when it gets into 50s anywhere, or even the low 60s, that can be really cold for the bass that are used to that warmer climate. So I might use a chunk style, no action trailer, even if the water is 60, just because those bass don't see a lot of cold water temps. But for the most part, I really think that 55 degrees is a good rule of thumb. So with that being said, let's look at these trailers, and I'm gonna tell you exactly what situation I use each one for. Now, before we talk about all these different trailers and the situations that I use them in, if you were to say, Tyler, I just want 2 trailers to use, I would tell you to get the Zoom Super Chunk and the Strike King Rage Crawl. These 2 trailers right here will basically do anything that you want to on the back of a jig. So if you look at all these trailers, on this left-hand side, we have the 2 smaller trailers. We have the Zoom Super Chunk Junior and we have the Zoom Speed Crawl. These 2 trailers to me are really reserved to finesse jigs. These are what I put on the back of a finesse jig pretty much 100% of the time. Now, again, if I'm fishing in that colder water temperature, I'm gonna go with the Zoom Super Chunk Junior that has 0 action. Now, if that water temperature is warmer, that's when I typically pick up the Speed Crawl. Another time that I'm going to use these 2 trailers is really when I'm fishing for smallmouth, because smallmouth obviously have small mouths. So I like to have a smaller plastic on the back of a finesse jig, and that is great for fishing for smallmouth. Now, another time that I'm going to use the Speed Crawl a lot, this bait right here, is when I'm fishing in grass situations. As you can see, the Speed Crawl is very narrow and the pinchers don't catch a lot of water, and they also don't catch a lot of grass. So that really makes going in and out of grass very easy. So if I'm flipping or pitching around offshore coontail or milfoil or hydrilla, a lot of times, for instance, I like this flip and jig by Freedom Tackle. It's made to go in and out of the grass, and on the back of that, I'm going to put the Zoom Speed Crawl. All right, bam, that's those 2. Let's look at the next 3 crawls that we have here. Zoom Super Chunk, Zoom Big Salty Chunk, and Zoom Salty Pro Chunk. These 3 trailers here, as you can see, they are all chunk style trailers, which means they have very little action to them at all, which means I'm going to fish them in colder water temps. Now, the only exception here is the Zoom Salty Pro Chunk. So I'm gonna push this one up here, kind of out of the way for now. Now, when I'm fishing in cold water and I'm not using a finesse jig, I am going to use one of these 2 trailers. Now, the biggest separator when it comes to fishing the Zoom Super Chunk versus the Zoom Big Salty Chunk all comes down to the presence that I'm trying to put off with my jig. Typically, when I rig up the Zoom Super Chunk, I'm actually going to thread the Zoom Super Chunk onto my jig. This really is going to create a compact jig, and it's something that I like to throw a lot when I'm fishing in cold water. So anytime I'm fishing a jig that's like a 3/8 ounce jig in cold water, this is what I'm going to put on. Now, there are situations where I actually like a bigger jig in that cold water. You know, if I'm fishing a lake like Lake Chickamauga in Tennessee that has a lot of big fish in it, those lakes, sometimes that big presence really helps you to get that extra big bite. In that situation, I'm going to use the Zoom Big Salty Chunk, and I'm actually not gonna thread it on like I do with the Zoom Super Chunk. I'm actually going to just tip my jig with that big salty chunk. All right, that is those 2 chunks there. Now, like I said, there's always some exceptions when it comes to bass fishing. And that to me is where this Zoom Salty Pro Chunk comes into hand. Sometimes during the summer months, if I'm fishing in really clear water, one of the best ways to actually get bass to trigger or to react to a bait is by fishing kind of a heavier jig in front of them so that it drops really quick in front of their face and they can't help but reach out and grab that bait. Like I said, this is typically a clearer water situation. Sometimes I like to fish brush piles this way, or if I'm fishing around shallow cover that's holding bass and I just want something to zip past them real quick, that is when I reach for the Zoom Salty Pro Chunk. As you can see, if I put the Zoom Big Salty Chunk next to this one, it's just a little bit longer than the big chunk here. And the other thing is it's a lot thinner. So that does 2 things for me. Because it's thinner, it's gonna catch less water, which is gonna help that bait to drop faster, which is exactly what I want. Now, the other reason that I like this when I'm fishing that way is because it is a longer chunk. Out of most of the trailers here, it is probably one of the longer chunk trailers. So it's gonna fall fast, but it also gives the bass more to kind of grab onto as it's going past their face. So that is one of those situations where I'm gonna use a chunk trailer that has no action in warm water when I want it to fall super fast past the bass to create that reaction strike. Let's move on to the two that I actually probably use the most out of any of these trailers. Now, like I said, anytime that I'm fishing that water temperature above 55 degrees, which honestly, that's most of the time when I'm out there fishing, these two trailers, the Berkley Chigger Crawl and the Strike King Rage Crawl, are the ones that I'm going to use. Maybe I'm flipping and pitching wood cover, maybe I am pitching up underneath of a dock, or maybe if I'm swimming a jig, these are the two jig trailers that I am going to use the most. Now, what separates these two trailers from each other is actually water displacement. It may not look like it, but the Berkley Chigger Crawl actually has more drag when you bring it through the water. These flappers really flap a lot, where the Rage Crawl, they're actually gonna flap as well, but it doesn't have as much drag as the Berkley Chigger Crawl. So anytime I'm fishing around stained or muddy water, I'm gonna pick up the Berkley Chigger Crawl because, again, it has a lot more drag, which means that there's a lot more water catching onto those pinchers, which also means that it's putting out a lot of vibration. And in muddy, heavily stained water, that's what you want. You want those bass to be able to hone in on that bait. And so using that Berkley Chigger Crawl is what I always put on my jigs. Now, if I'm fishing in clear water or water that just has a little bit of stain to it, that is when I'm going to pick up the Strike King Rage Crawl. This is one of my favorite baits on the back of a football jig. This is also one of my favorite baits on the back of a swim jig because it doesn't have as much drag. You can swim it really well around vegetation or wood or anything like that. Now, the other exception to the rule that we talked about earlier is when I'm fishing a swim jig in colder, muddy water. There have been several times where I've been fishing some off-color water that's anywhere from 50 to 55 degrees, and if I'm not throwing a bait like a spinner bait in that situation, a swim jig is a great alternative, and the bait that I typically use is that Berkley Chigger Crawl because, again, it has a lot of kick, and having that kick in that muddy water, even if it's colder, tends to help you catch more bass. Now, honestly, being on the tail end of me shooting this, I honestly feel like I probably complicated jig trailers more than it need to be. And like I said earlier, if there's just two trailers that I would recommend, I would go with the Zoom Super Chunk and the Strike King Rage Crawl. These are two trailers that you have on the opposite sides of the spectrum. You have one that has action and one that has no action, and these are gonna work in 90% of situations. Now, as I promised, there are two other trailers that I use from time to time, and the first one is going to be a swim bait, kind of like your Kitech. For this one here, I think is a Strike King Rage Swimmer. Most of the time that I use the Rage Swimmer, I'm really just trying to imitate shad. So if I'm fishing a white swim jig, you know, maybe around boat docks, trying to imitate shad, this is something that I'm going to use. Anytime I'm fishing around the shad spawn, this is a bait that I'm going to use as a trailer. Now, the only other bait that I've used on the back of a jig at times is a stick bait, soft stick bait like this. This is your standard Cinco. One time I was using this on the back of a jig in Florida, and it actually made a huge difference. I was using a black and blue stick bait at that time, and that was really a big difference because bass in Florida just seem to love stick baits like this, and I felt like I was getting more bites because of it. Now, another situation where you might use a stick bait is in highly pressured bodies of water. If you're fishing really pressured bodies of water, most of the time guys are gonna be using different crawl style baits like we got here, but they're not gonna be using a stick bait like this. So showing the bass something different can help you to catch bass at times. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video, and if you want to watch a video of me catching bass on a jig in cold water, you can click this link right here. Also, don't forget, if you want to pick up some of the baits and trailers that I talked about, you can hit that link in the description. Comment below, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.